I abandoned my wife and ran away with my children when I saw her with a strange man. It wasn't just the sight of them together, but what hid behind that forbidden connection that left me floored. In that instant, everything I believed to be safe and unshakable was destroyed. The smile on her lips, the uncomfortable closeness between the two, the furtive glances, it was clear that there was more there than any innocent explanation could justify. The blood pounded in my head, my vision blurred, and as the scene unfolded before me, a single question echoed mercilessly: why? Betrayal, for many, is an abyss of pain. For me, in that moment, it became a silent scream, a frozen fury. Every step I took toward the car felt like it weighed tons. My children, in the back seat, noticed my labored breathing and the unbearable silence. "Daddy, are you okay?" my daughter asked in a hesitant voice, but I couldn't answer. The lump in my throat was too strong, my mind was filled with images I never wanted to see. The previous weeks had been a cruel spectacle that now revealed itself in a single blow. The sudden smiles on her face when reading messages on her cell phone, the excuses for prolonged absences, the perfume that didn't match our usual encounters. I ignored it, like someone who is afraid to open their eyes and see the monster hidden in the dark. But the monster was already in our house, smiling as it stabbed me in the back. "He's just a colleague," she would say when I questioned the calls that ended abruptly. "You're imagining things," she laughed, accusing me of being jealous. But that afternoon, as the two said goodbye with a hug that lasted longer than it should have, I realized that I wasn't imagining anything. It was real. They were real. And I needed to get out of there before that scenario consumed what little sanity I had left. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to piece together a life that was silently falling apart. Memories invaded like a movie without pause. Our years together, the promises whispered in the darkness of the room, the dreams we built side by side. Everything now seemed like a lie. When I finally parked at a cheap motel on the side of the road, my children's faces in the rearview mirror brought me back to reality. They were my priority now. Even though I didn't understand what was happening, their confused expressions carried a weight that I couldn't bear. My oldest son tried to hide it, but the look of concern was there. "What are we going to do, Daddy?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. I had no answers. Not yet. That night, while the two of them slept in the small single bed they shared, I sat alone in the corner of the room. The cell phone was on the table, blinking with unread messages. I knew who it was. "Can we talk?" said the last one. But what was left to be said? The words had already lost their meaning. The images of the day wouldn't leave me alone. Every detail, every movement. The way he touched her shoulder, the way she smiled. My chest hurt, and it wasn't just from the betrayal. It was the feeling that, while I dedicated myself to keeping our family together, she found comfort in other people's arms. It was because of the humiliation of knowing that, even when I believed I was enough, I never was. Did I do something wrong? I asked out loud, knowing no one would answer. It wasn't a question of shared blame. What she did was a choice, and choices have consequences. The problem was that these consequences were starting to consume me. I couldn't let that define me. I needed to act, but how? The following days were a blur of unanswered questions. My mind wavered between anger and disbelief. She tried to call several times, but I ignored her. It wasn't the time. I needed to compose myself before facing her. But as she tried to explain, another doubt grew within me. What if her involvement was more than just emotional? What if there was something bigger behind that man? It didn't take long for the first pieces of the puzzle to emerge. A close friend, upon hearing my situation, mentioned something I didn't expect. "You know he's not exactly who he seems, right?" My head swam. What did this mean? I decided to investigate, even though I didn't know if I was ready to discover the truth. What came next was a revelation that not only shook me, but also completely changed the course of my life. I discovered he had a murky past, involved in shady dealings that now put my family at risk. My wife was not just an accomplice in betrayal, she was somehow involved in something much bigger, much more dangerous. And worse, she knew. When I confronted her, her reaction was a mix of fear and despair. "I didn't want things to come to this," she began, tears in her eyes. But nothing she said could erase what she had done. Her every word felt like a nail in a coffin she built herself. I no longer recognized her. That woman was not the same one I had built a life with. "What did he promise you?" I asked, trying to contain the anger that pulsed through my veins. She looked away, unable to look at me. "It was a mistake, I didn't know," he started to say, but I interrupted. "You didn't know. You knew enough to betray me. You knew enough to put our children at risk. Didn't you know that would end everything?" As she tried to justify herself, I realized that the person I loved was gone a long time ago. The man she got involved with was just the trigger for something that had been growing inside her, a dissatisfaction, a search for something that, apparently, I could never offer. But that didn't justify his actions. It didn't take away the pain. Now, here I am, sitting in front of the sea, trying to figure out how to rebuild the pieces of my life. I don't know what the future holds, but one thing I know for sure, she and that man will have to face the consequences of their choices. Because, in the end, there is no escaping the weight of betrayal. What really happened between the two and how could it impact the rest of our lives? This is an answer that only time will reveal. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not tolerate or support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives, families and hearts. Get ready, because today's story is intense, full of twists and revelations that will leave you breathless. Take a deep breath and enjoy this impactful journey. The sound of Michael's hurried footsteps echoed down the sidewalk as he tightly held the small hand of Emma, his 5-year-old daughter, who insisted on jumping between the cracks in the pavement as if it were a game. Her innocent smile was one of the few things that made him forget the weight of his worries, even if for a moment. Beside her, Emma's older brother, Lucas, walked in silence, his headphones drowning out the world around him. He was 12 years old and was already beginning to show the first signs of independence and rebellion. Michael watched the two as a feeling of melancholy invaded him. Those children were everything to him, and the thought of failing as a father consumed him more than anything else. The house they were returning to was in a quiet neighborhood, a reflection of the stable life he and Rachel had built over the years. It was a modest building, with walls painted in neutral tones and a small garden in front that Rachel loved to tend. Michael always said that that garden was just like her, delicate, well cared for, but with a strength that defied the most difficult seasons. He remembered how Rachel looked with dirt on her hands, her hair tied up in any way, but always with that sparkle in her eyes. She was like that, capable of transforming small details into something special. When he walked through the front door and smelled jasmine coming from the garden, it was like everything made sense. The family's routine was, at first glance, ordinary. Michael was a manager at a logistics company and spent much of his day at work, while Rachel divided her time between taking care of the children and the art classes she taught in a small studio. For many, they represented the ideal couple, united, dedicated to their children and apparently happy. Michael always believed his life was good. Not perfect, but good enough to feel grateful. There were occasional arguments, of course, as in any marriage, but he always thought they were normal. Rachel, however, seemed to carry something different in her eyes lately. Something he couldn't fully identify. He remembered how it all started between them, more than a decade ago. Rachel was the liveliest girl he had ever met. There was something magnetic about her, an energy that made anyone feel lighter. When she danced, it seemed like the world around her disappeared. And that's how he fell in love, watching her at a party, her carefree movements and the smile she cast effortlessly. Time has brought changes, of course. That spontaneity of Rachel gave way to a mature serenity, but Michael could still see remnants of the girl he fell in love with, especially in the moments when she played with the children. That night, Rachel was in the studio painting when they arrived. The open windows let out soft music, a habit of hers to keep her creativity flowing. Michael watched her for a moment before entering. She seemed absorbed in her work, her hands stained with paint, her eyes fixed on the screen. "How was your day?" she asked without looking away, as he walked in with Emma and Lucas. Michael replied something generic, but he couldn't help but notice the tension in his voice, as if something was stuck there. Rachel finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a tiredness that went beyond the physical. He wanted to ask what was wrong, but he didn't. Maybe it was just the weight of routine, he thought. The following days brought more of the same. Small interactions between Michael and Rachel became brief, almost mechanical. She was more distracted than usual, but she always found plausible excuses: the workload, the deadlines for the upcoming exhibitions. Michael tried not to take it personally. After all, he himself was overwhelmed, and the silence between them was, in his view, just a phase that would eventually pass. Lucas, on the other hand, seemed more aware of the changes in the house. He watched his parents with silent curiosity, his eyes darting from one to the other throughout dinner, as if trying to decipher something. Emma, with her childish innocence, was oblivious to everything. She spent her afternoons drawing on the living room carpet, and her creations were invariably full of hearts and family portraits. "That's you, Daddy, holding my hand," she said, pointing to a colorful scribble. Michael was smiling, but that simplicity hit him like a stab. He wondered if he was doing enough to keep that happiness intact. The weekend arrived, and Rachel suggested a trip to the park. It was the first time in weeks that Michael had seen a bit of the old Rachel emerge. She played with the kids, took photos of them as they ran around the lawn, and even laughed at one of Michael's lame jokes. But there was something about her smile that seemed forced, like she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay. Michael noticed, but decided not to comment. He wanted to believe that this moment of levity was the first step in getting things back to normal. That night, while tidying up the kitchen after dinner, Michael heard Rachel talking on the phone upstairs. He wasn't the suspicious type, but something in her tone made him stop. The voice was low, almost like a whisper, but it carried an intensity that he couldn't ignore. When she came downstairs, she seemed calm, as if nothing had happened. Michael thought about asking who was on the other end of the line, but stopped himself. Maybe it was just a friend or something work-related. He didn't want to appear paranoid. The following month brought a sequence of seemingly ordinary events that carried increasing weight for Michael. He noticed small details that previously went unnoticed: messages on her cell phone that Rachel deleted too quickly, excuses to leave the house without much explanation, a different perfume that wasn't hers. Michael began to question if it was just his imagination or if something was really wrong. He wanted to believe the first option, but his instinct said otherwise. The household routine took its course. Mornings were filled with the chaos of getting the children ready for school, and nights ended with everyone lost in their own pursuits. Rachel spent more time in the studio, while Michael tried to be more involved with Emma and Lucas. He wanted to be the anchor of that family, even though he felt like the ground beneath his feet was starting to crumble. That Sunday, while they were tidying up the garden together, Rachel made a comment that kept echoing in Michael's mind. "Sometimes I think we need a break," she said, without looking at him, as if speaking more to herself. Michael paused for a moment, trying to understand the meaning of those words. He wanted to ask what exactly she meant, but he couldn't find the courage. The idea of confronting her seemed too scary, as if opening that door might bring up something he wasn't ready to face. As the sun set, lighting the sky with orange tones, Michael felt a tightness in his chest. He looked at Rachel, who was watching the children playing in the distance, and wondered if it was still possible to bring back the woman he had fallen in love with. The silence between them seemed to scream louder and louder, but the words to fill that void simply didn't come. Something was about to change, and Michael knew it. He just didn't know how or when, but the feeling was inevitable, like a storm about to hit the coast. Michael's days began to carry a different weight, as if every minute was accompanied by a shadow that he couldn't see clearly. Rachel continued her routine in the studio, always busy, always surrounded by tasks that justified her irregular schedules and the distance that seemed to grow between the two. He tried to convince himself that this was normal, that time wears on any relationship and that perhaps he was being dramatic. But the feeling that something was slipping through his fingers wouldn't leave him alone. It was a silent restlessness, something he felt in her gaze, in the absence of contact, in the way her hands moved away from his at the dinner table. One afternoon, as Michael was finishing a report at work, the phone vibrated on the table. A message from Rachel, informing her that she would need to stay late in the studio to finish a commissioned piece. He knew he shouldn't think about it too much, but Rachel's recent habit of staying out late into the night bothered him. It's just work, he told himself as he tried to refocus on the spreadsheets in front of him. Deep down, a question remained: why did she seem more and more distant, even at home? Why did her gaze, which had once been so welcoming, now seem so evasive? Tension was building like a rope being stretched to its limit. Small gestures that previously went unnoticed now seemed to have another meaning. The messages on Rachel's cell phone, sent with a smile that she tried to hide, the calls that ended abruptly when he entered the room, the recurring excuse of being too busy when he suggested they take time just for themselves. Michael tried to ignore it, tried to convince himself that it was just the paranoia of someone who wasn't used to change. But the doubts were stubborn and kept creeping in. Lucas, always attentive, began to notice his father's behavior. He watched Michael as they ate dinner, his eyes full of questions that were never asked. Emma, with her childlike innocence, still snuggled into her father's lap with his colorful drawings, but even she seemed to notice that something was different. The house, once full of laughter and conversations, was now filled with silences that weighed more than any word spoken. And although no one spoke out loud, everyone knew something was out of place. Late one Friday, Michael decided to do something he had never done before. When Rachel said she would need to leave again to take care of business at the studio, he waited for her to leave, left the children with the neighbor and followed her. His heart was beating fast as he drove through the streets, trying to keep enough distance to not be noticed. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he could no longer ignore the signs. Maybe it was just work, maybe it was all in your head. He wanted to believe it, but the weight in the pit of his stomach said otherwise. Rachel drove to an inconspicuous restaurant downtown, a place Michael recognized immediately. It was the kind of place where couples met in search of privacy, where the tables were arranged to create little isolated worlds. He parked the car at a safe distance and watched as she exited the vehicle. She was smiling. Not just any smile, but one he hadn't seen in a long time, the one that lit up her face like the first years of their marriage. Michael felt his chest tighten. He still didn't know what was happening, but something inside him was already starting to break. The man who met her at the restaurant door was taller, dressed carefully, and the way he touched her arm was enough to make Michael grip the steering wheel tightly. He was unable to move for a few minutes, as if his body had been paralyzed by the scene. Rachel and the man entered the restaurant, laughing, and the door closed behind them, leaving Michael alone with his doubts now transformed into something closer to certainty. He didn't know whether he felt anger, sadness, or an unbearable mix of the two. What he knew was that he needed answers. He got out of the car and walked to the restaurant, but stopped before entering. He didn't want to make a scene, he didn't want to expose his pain in front of strangers. Instead, he walked around the side of the building, where windows provided a partial view of the interior. The table where Rachel sat with the man was close enough that he could see them, but far enough away that he couldn't hear their conversation. Michael stood there, silently, watching as they laughed, as the gestures between them grew more and more intimate. His hand touched hers on the table, and Rachel didn't flinch. Every second felt like an eternity as Michael fought the urge to barge in and demand explanations. He knew that moment would change everything. The questions he had avoided for weeks were now answered, but the pain of facing the truth was unbearable. When Rachel got up to go to the bathroom, Michael decided he couldn't wait any longer. He entered the restaurant and walked to the table where the man was sitting, still oblivious to his presence. "Who are you?" Michael's voice was firm, but full of emotion. The man looked up, surprised, and tried to formulate a response, but Michael interrupted him. "It doesn't matter who you are. What matters is what you're doing here with my wife." Before the man could react, Rachel came back from the bathroom and stopped, shocked, to see him there. "Michael, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice thick with nervousness. "I could ask you the same question, Rachel," he replied, his gaze fixed on her, waiting for something, anything that would explain that moment. The silence between them was like a blow, filled with everything that couldn't be said. Michael knew that nothing she said at that moment would make a difference. The image of them together, the smile, the touches, everything was etched in his mind. He took a step back, took a deep breath, and looked at Rachel one last time before leaving. He needed to leave, needed to get out of there before the pain turned into something bigger. When he got back to the car, Michael felt tears burning in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He had to be strong for his children, for what was left of his family. But the question that echoed in his mind had no answer: how could someone he loved so much do this? He knew the betrayal was just the beginning, and what came next could be even more devastating. Michael stared at Rachel with an expression that mixed disbelief, hurt and contained fury. The room was plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by the muffled sound of Lucas' footsteps climbing the stairs, oblivious to the storm brewing downstairs. Rachel shifted uncomfortably on the couch, avoiding Michael's gaze, but she knew there was no way to escape. He had asked the children to go to bed early that night. Something in the tone of his voice had prevented her from protesting. Now, sitting across from each other in the room, the weight of what he knew became impossible to ignore. "I need to hear it from you, Rachel," he began, his voice low and thick with emotion. "I need you to tell me everything, bluntly, without excuses. Because if you try to hide anything, there will be no going back." Rachel sighed, feeling his words like a blow. Her heart was beating fast, and for a moment she wished it were possible to erase everything, as if the truth didn't exist. But it was too late. He knew about the man, he knew about the lies, but he didn't know everything. "I didn't know the worst. Michael, She hesitated, her throat dry, the words stuck in her mind. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But I never meant for it to hurt you." He looked at her with a cold expression, which did not match the internal storm he felt. "A mistake," he repeated, the words filled with bitterness. "You call destroying everything we've built a mistake? A mistake is forgetting to pay a bill, Rachel. What you did is something completely different." Rachel closed her eyes, feeling the tears welling up. It wasn't just the betrayal that weighed on her, but the secret she now needed to confess. She knew that once she revealed what had happened, there was no going back. Michael wouldn't be able to look at her the same way, and the world they knew would fall apart. But he deserved to know, and the silence was only making everything more unbearable. He took a deep breath before speaking, the words shaking as they came out. "Michael, the man you saw. He's not just someone I was involved with," he began, his voice barely audible. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers, as if he wanted to get the truth out of her. He's Lucas's biological father," she said finally, as if the words weighed tons. The room seemed to freeze. Michael recoiled, as if he had been punched, and for a moment he was silent, processing what he had just heard. The shock was so great that he had to repeat the phrase in his mind several times before understanding its meaning. "What?" he finally said, his voice cracking. "Are you telling me Lucas isn't my son?" Rachel tried to hold back the tears, but it was useless. She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Michael, I swear, I never wanted you to find out like this. Before he could finish, he stood up suddenly, pacing the room as if he needed to move to contain the explosion of feelings building inside him. "Is this a joke?" he shouted, his voice finally breaking. You lied to me all these years. You made me believe that Lucas was my son, you made me raise him, love him, as if he were mine. And now, you just tell me that, as if it were any other detail. Rachel got up too, trying to get closer, but he raised his hand to stop her. Stay away, Rachel. I need space. She took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Michael, I never wanted it to be this way. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. You were the only man I trusted, the only man I knew I could build a life with. And you were a father incredible for him. None of this changes that. He laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. None of this changes that. Rachel, it changes everything. You made me live a lie for 12 years. 12 years. Don't you understand what that means to me? Rachel's eyes were puffy, and she looked like a shadow of the woman he knew. I understand, Michael. I understand that I hurt you more than anything. But I never lied about loving you. I never lied about wanting you to be his father, because deep down, you are. You are the only father you know, and nothing can change that. Michael shook his head, unable to process it all. Do you think that's some kind of consolation? That the fact that I've been a devoted father to a child that isn't my own will unknowingly make me feel better? He stopped walking and turned to her, his eyes now filled with tears. What about Lucas? Does he know? Rachel shook her head quickly. No, he doesn't know. I never wanted him to know, I never wanted it to affect your relationship. Please, Michael, don't tell him. He loves you, and you are everything to him. Michael laughed again, this time in pure despair. And what did you expect, Rachel? For me to just move on, pretending none of this happened? For me to keep living this lie for the rest of my life? She took a step forward, her eyes pleading. I just want you to think about Lucas, Michael. He's not to blame for this. He needs you, just like Emma does. You're the rock of this family, and I know I screwed up, but they still need you. Michael stared at her for a long moment, his heart in pieces. You know what the worst part is, Rachel? I still love you. Even after all of this, I still love you. But this is something I don't know if I can get over. He left the room, leaving Rachel alone in tears and silence. In the bedroom, he sat on the bed, looking lost. Every memory, every moment lived with Lucas now felt like an open wound. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't just abandon him. Lucas was his son, regardless of anything. The question that remained was how he could rebuild his life from that moment on, with the truth now exposed and the weight of a betrayal that seemed impossible to overcome. Michael spent the night awake, sitting in the armchair next to the bed, with his hands in his hair and his gaze fixed on an invisible point on the wall. Rachel's words echoed in his mind, each sentence like a knife slowly turning inside him. He tried to make sense of everything he had discovered, but each attempt only seemed to sink him deeper into a pit of pain and confusion. The silence in the house was almost deafening, interrupted only by the light footsteps of Lucas, who woke up in the middle of the night to get water and hesitated when he saw his father there, so still, so different from the man he knew. The next morning, Michael decided he needed to get out of the house, at least for a few hours. Rachel watched him from the kitchen door as he left, with Emma clinging to her legs, oblivious to the weight hanging over everyone. Lucas was in the room, with headphones on, but he seemed to observe everything with his peripheral vision, as if he was trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle that he didn't even know he was putting together. Michael drove aimlessly for almost an hour until he stopped at a park he used to frequent when he needed to think. The place was empty except for a few trees swaying gently in the wind. He sat down on a bench and stood there, looking at the floor, trying to organize his thoughts. How could he face Lucas after all that? How could he continue living under the same roof as Rachel, knowing everything she had hidden? He felt like he was on an emotional battlefield, torn between love for his children, anger at betrayal, and the crushing pain of a truth that tore him apart. When the phone rang, he thought about ignoring it, but when he saw Rachel's name on the screen, he answered, albeit reluctantly. Her voice was hesitant, full of caution. "Michael, please come home. We need to talk more. We can't leave things like this. The children." He interrupted her before she finished. "I don't know if I can, Rachel. I don't know how to go back to a place that doesn't feel like mine anymore." She was silent for a few seconds before responding, her voice firmer now. "Michael, you've always been strong. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. I know I messed up, but if we don't do this for ourselves, we need to do it for the kids. Please, just come back. We need to talk about what comes next." He hung up without answering, but he knew he couldn't run away forever. With a heavy heart, he drove home, each kilometer feeling like a test of endurance. When he walked in, Rachel was in the living room, alone, holding a cup of coffee like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked at him with eyes that were red from crying, but Michael felt no compassion. He felt only the tiredness of someone carrying too great a burden. "I don't know what you expect from me now," he said, crossing his arms and stopping at a safe distance. "I'm back, but I don't know how we can even begin to fix this." Rachel placed the cup on the table and took a step towards him, but he instinctively stepped back, as if any physical proximity was too much. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Michael. I know I don't deserve this. But I want you to know that everything I did was because I thought it was best for Lucas, for you, for all of us. It was selfish, yes, but it was out of fear. I was afraid of losing you before I even had you completely." Michael laughed, but there was no humor in his laugh. "Out of fear? Rachel, you destroyed everything out of fear. You built our entire life on a lie because you were afraid. What does that say about what we meant to you? What does that say about me?" She swallowed hard, fighting to maintain her composure. "It means that I'm a coward, Michael. That I was weak. But that doesn't change the fact that you were the best father Lucas could have had. And he needs you now more than ever." The mention of Lucas made something inside Michael snap. He took a deep breath, trying to find words that weren't filled with anger. "You know what's hardest about all this? It's not even the betrayal, or the fact that Lucas isn't my biological son. It's that, in all these years, you've never trusted me enough to share the truth. I could have understood, Rachel. Maybe I could have even helped. But you took it away from me. You took away from me the chance to choose how to deal with this." Rachel lowered her head, tears flowing silently. "I know, Michael. I know I took this from you. And I will carry this guilt forever. But now we need to think about how to move forward. Lucas doesn't know anything, and I don't want him to find out. He loves you like father, and that can't change. Please, Michael, help me protect this, if not for me, then for him." Before Michael could respond, Lucas appeared in the doorway of the room, his arms crossed and a curious expression on his face. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice thick with suspicion. Michael and Rachel exchanged quick glances, both trying to decide how to handle the situation. "Nothing, son," Michael said finally, trying to sound convincing. "Your mother and I were just talking about some things. It's nothing to worry about." But Lucas didn't seem convinced. He looked from one to the other, eyes narrowing, before shrugging and heading back to the bedroom. When he went upstairs, Michael sighed and sat down on the couch, running his hands over his face. "Rachel, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how to move on from this. But for now, I agree that Lucas shouldn't know. He's not to blame for what happened. But that doesn't mean I'll forgive you or forget what you did." She nodded, wiping away her tears. "That's enough for now, Michael. Thank you." He didn't respond, just got up and went to his room, closing the door behind him. As he lay in bed, his mind full of confused thoughts, a single certainty tormented him: his life would never be the same. And, as much as he wanted to protect Lucas, the doubt about how it would all end consumed him. Michael spent the next few days in a state of constant restlessness, as if every second carried an impossible weight. The house's routine seemed to drag on, marked by uncomfortable silences and looks that said more than any words. Rachel did her best to maintain a semblance of normalcy, taking care of daily chores and keeping the kids occupied, but Michael saw through it. He knew she was also trapped in her own web of regret and fear, fearing his every move, every decision he might make. Lucas began to ask more questions, some direct, others veiled, but all filled with a suspicion that was impossible to ignore. He noticed the growing distance between his parents and, even without fully understanding what was happening, he felt the impact of it. One night, as Michael sat at the table with an untouched cup of coffee, Lucas walked into the kitchen and sat down next to him, saying nothing for a few minutes. Finally, he broke the silence with a hesitant voice, as if he had rehearsed the question several times before finally having the courage to say it. "Dad, are you and Mom fighting because of me?" Michael felt his stomach drop. He looked at Lucas, trying to decide how to respond, while the boy stared at him with eyes that mixed fear and determination. He wanted to protect him, wanted to keep him from carrying any weight that wasn't his own, but he also knew he couldn't lie completely. "No, son," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "What's going on between your mother and I isn't your fault. These are complicated things that we need to work out, but none of that changes how much I love you or how important you are to me." Lucas seemed to relax a little with the words, but the look of doubt was still there, as if he knew there was more to that answer. Meanwhile, Rachel desperately tried to find a way to redeem herself, to rebuild the trust she had destroyed. She suggested couples therapy, but Michael refused. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he said, his voice thick with weariness. "Maybe another time, but right now. I just need time to figure out what to do." She didn't insist, but the look of defeat on her face made it clear she was running out of options. One night, while Michael was in the office reviewing some documents, Rachel entered silently, carrying a small box. "I found this in our closet," she said, placing the box on the table. "They're memories from when Lucas was little. I thought you might want to see them." He looked at her, trying to understand her intentions, but decided to open the box. Inside were photos, drawings and small objects that Lucas had made over the years. Michael picked up one of the photos, where he and Lucas were laughing together in a park, and felt a rush of conflicting emotions. The anger and pain were still there, but there was also a deep, unwavering love for this boy he had raised as his son. Rachel watched silently as he examined the contents of the box. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she expected. "I can't just forget what happened, Rachel. But I also can't ignore that Lucas is my son, no matter what. It's not going to change. I don't know how to move on from this." She nodded, trying to hide the tears that threatened to fall. "I know, Michael. I know that nothing I say or do will take away what happened. But please don't give up on us. Don't give up on him." In the days that followed, Michael began spending more time with Lucas, trying to strengthen their connection. He took him to play football in the park, helped him with his schoolwork and even taught him a few things in the car, even though Lucas was still far from old enough to drive. Every moment felt like an attempt to reaffirm something he feared losing, even though he knew that relationship didn't need to be reaffirmed. Lucas was, and always would be, his son. Rachel, on the other hand, began to isolate herself more. She spent long hours in the studio, often producing nothing. It was as if the guilt had paralyzed her, preventing her from moving forward in any meaningful way. Michael noticed this, but didn't know how to help. He was also struggling to find balance, and the wounds were still too raw for him to be able to offer her any kind of support. The moral dilemma he faced continued to torment him. He knew he needed to do what was best for Lucas and Emma, but the question of how to deal with Rachel remained unanswered. He felt that regardless of his choice, someone would get hurt. And deep down, he knew he would never be able to look at Rachel the same way. The trust that was the foundation of everything they had built had been destroyed, and he didn't know if it was possible to rebuild it. One morning, while having breakfast alone in the kitchen, Rachel came in and sat down at the table. For a moment, neither of them said anything, but the silence was full of unsaid things. Finally, Rachel broke the silence. "Michael, I was thinking, maybe it's best if I leave for a while. Let you and the kids stay here, so you can have the space you need." He looked at her, surprised. "And where would you go?" She shrugged, trying to sound indifferent, but her voice was shaking slightly. "I can stay in the studio for a while. There's enough space for me there. It's not ideal, but maybe it's what we need right now." Michael was silent, processing the suggestion. He knew space could help, but he also knew it would be a step towards something more permanent, something he wasn't sure he wanted yet. "I don't know, Rachel. Is this really what you want?" She shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Of course not. I don't want to leave my family. But if this is what you need to start healing, I'm willing to do it." He nodded slowly, still uncertain, but recognizing her effort in trying to do what was right. Rachel spent the next few days organizing her things, while Michael tried to explain to the children that she would need to be away for a while. Emma didn't fully understand and cried a lot, clinging to her mother's legs and begging her not to go. Lucas, on the other hand, was silent, but the look on his face showed that he knew something much bigger was going on. Michael tried to comfort them both, but he felt his words were insufficient. The night Rachel left, the silence in the house seemed even deeper. Michael sat on the couch with Emma asleep on his lap and Lucas at his side, his eyes fixed on the television but clearly lost in thought. He looked at his children and felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Regardless of what happened from then on, he knew he needed to be strong for them. Because at the end of the day, they were all that really mattered. Michael woke up that morning with a strange sense of calm, a quiet respite from the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed him over the past few weeks. The house was silent, except for Emma's light footsteps in the hallway, with her drawings in hand, seeking her father's approval. He looked at her and felt something that couldn't be broken, a connection that no bitter truth could erase. Lucas was still in the room, and Michael knew that his silence was as heavy as his own thoughts. After Rachel temporarily moved into the studio, days at the house became a delicate dance of adjustment. Lucas spent more time in his room, immersed in his music, while Emma seemed more needy, always trying to get Michael's attention. He did his best to give them the emotional support they needed, but the truth was that he was still struggling to find his own balance. "I missed normality, even though I knew it would never be completely recovered." On a sunny afternoon, Lucas finally broke the silence he had maintained since Rachel's departure. He approached Michael in the backyard, where his father was pruning some plants that had grown wildly. Lucas's voice was hesitant, but it carried a weight that Michael recognized immediately. "Dad, I know there's something wrong. You and Mom are different, and I'm not enough of a kid to not notice it anymore. I just want to know if it's something with me. Did I do something wrong?" Michael stopped what he was doing, feeling his chest tighten at the question. He turned to Lucas, looking him in the eye, and saw there not only the boy he had raised, but someone desperately searching for an answer. He took a deep breath before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "Son, you did nothing wrong. What's happening between me and your mother is not your fault. These are things we need to work out as adults, but I want you to know that none of this changes how much I love you. You are mine son, Lucas, and always will be." Lucas looked like he wanted to believe it, but there was something in his eyes that showed he wasn't completely convinced. He nodded, muttering an "okay" before heading back inside. Michael knew that conversation wasn't enough, but he also knew that there were limits to how much he could protect Lucas from the truth. Meanwhile, Rachel did her best to keep busy in the studio, but loneliness and guilt were like a constant shadow. She spent her nights going through old drawings of Lucas and Emma, remembering times when life seemed simpler. She missed everything, the routine, the mess of the kids, the comfortable silence she shared with Michael. But he also knew he had to face the consequences of his choices. There was no turning back. One day, while Rachel was in the studio, Michael unexpectedly showed up. She was surprised to see him, but something in his expression indicated that he wasn't there to argue or accuse her. He sat down on one of the studio chairs and was silent for a moment before speaking. "Rachel, I've been thinking a lot. About everything. And I realize that despite all the pain, I need to find a way to move on. For myself, for the kids, and even for you. I don't know if we can go back to being the that we were, but I think we should try to find a way to get along. Lucas and Emma need this." Rachel felt a surge of emotion and struggled to maintain her composure. She knew Michael's words were a peace offering, even if it was timid and conditional. "Michael, I know I don't deserve your understanding, much less your forgiveness, but I want to try. I want to do whatever it takes to rebuild what I destroyed, even if it's just a little." In the following months, the family dynamics began to change. Michael and Rachel established a system where she stayed with the kids a few days a week at the studio, while he remained at home. It was strange at first, but little by little things started to adjust. Lucas started talking to both of them more, and Emma seemed less anxious. The balance was still fragile, but it was there. The hardest moment came when Michael decided to tell Lucas the truth. He knew it was something that needed to be done, even if he feared his son's reaction. He chose a quiet afternoon, while the two played football in the backyard. They sat down on the lawn after a few minutes, and Michael began to speak, his voice shaking slightly. "Lucas, there's something I need to tell you. Something that isn't easy, but that you deserve to know." Lucas looked at him, curious and a little apprehensive. Michael took a deep breath before continuing. "I'm not your biological father." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas stared at him, trying to process what he had just heard. "What do you mean?" he finally asked, his voice full of disbelief. Michael explained everything as carefully as possible, emphasizing that it didn't change anything in their relationship. "I raised you, I watched you grow, I was by your side in all the important moments. You are my son, Lucas. And nothing, nor anyone, can change that." Lucas was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "I don't know what to say. This is a lot to take in." Michael nodded, understanding his son's confusion. "I know, son. And I'm here to answer any questions you have. But I want you to know that my love for you has never changed and will never change." Lucas looked at him for a moment before hugging him, and Michael felt an indescribable relief. It was a step in the right direction. Rachel, in turn, continued to try to rebuild her relationship with the children and Michael. She knew the process would be long and full of obstacles, but she was determined to do whatever was necessary. One afternoon, while painting in the studio, Lucas showed up unannounced. He was silent for a moment before speaking. "Mom, I know about everything. What happened to you and Dad, and about who I am. I just wanted to say that despite everything, I still love you. But I need time to understand all of this." Rachel felt the tears flow as she nodded. "I understand, son. And I love you more than anything in the world. Thank you for giving me a chance to be your real mother." Lucas smiled slightly before leaving, and Rachel felt, for the first time in a long time, a spark of hope. Michael eventually began to find peace by accepting that the past could not be changed, but the future was still in his hands. He decided that, even if his relationship with Rachel didn't go back to what it was before, he wanted to be happy again. And over time, he began to make room in his life for new possibilities, learning to balance his wounds with the need to move forward. And so, each member of that family found their way, carrying the scars of the past, but also the strength to build something new. The betrayal had left deep scars, but it also brought to light truths that, although painful, brought them closer together in unexpected ways. And in the end, everyone learned that love, even imperfect, can be enough to start again. What did you think of this story? Share your opinion in the comments. We want to know your view on the events and characters. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, our channel does not support any type of betrayal, and the stories told here aim to show how wrong choices can irreversibly impact lives. Until next time.